Desideravo accompagnare un viaggio che dal punto di vista scientifico ho iniziato insieme a tanti altri collaboratori italiani across Europe. So this is a journey that, as the old Orient Express, will start in London and will go down to the extreme south end, as you'll see in a minute, of our Europe. It's a pre-Brexit journey, so at that time, UK was completely European. So the purpose of my journey is to address two questions, which are not just academic questions. These are questions that are very relevant to my clinical practice as well, because I'm a general adult psychiatry that looks after young people who develop psychosis. So the first one is, who actually are the cannabis users that develop psychosis? Because we all know that this is a small proportion of people that actually use cannabis. And it would be useful to all of us to be able to identify their risk profile. And it might be that it's something to do with what they use and how much they use, as you can see from the size of the joints that Shakespeare has chosen. So size might matters in the risk of psychosis when it's about cannabis use. And there is also some suggestion, obviously, that, for instance, genetic vulnerability might play a role, but I won't talk about this today. But the second question is, and this is something that usually people ask me, mostly as a criticism to the data that I tend to present, if it is true that cannabis use is associated with risk of psychosis, we actually have any evidence that the increased cannabis use has been associated with changes in the incidence of psychosis. And this has been a difficult question to answer, except that now, thanks actually to James and his team, I can get closer to address it. So my journey starts, as the Orient Express would have, in London. And importantly, I would like to introduce to you what is cannabis when we talk about London. So if you come to London, you will come across this type of cannabis, which is a traditional imported herbal cannabis. But also you will come across this sister. It's the same plant, but you can see it looks very different. And this is to do to genetic, but also environmental manipulation. So the one on your right is what you will call in the street of London skunk. It's the female plant that's not been pollinated. And the result is that this enormous density of what you call trichomes, which is actually where the active ingredients of cannabis are contained. So you can imagine that the amount of active ingredient between this and this is very different. And also the concentration of active ingredients, so cannabinoids, determines the smell. And this is why it's called skunk. It's actually taken me a few years to discover that skunk meant puzzola, which is the name associated with a strong smell. And this is the old-fashioned soap bar or raisin. And the Home Office in UK produced a first report which was able to tell us that if you did come across actually if you came across skunk, you would expect delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which you can abbreviate as THC, around 16%. And this was pretty much the main active ingredient you were able to detect, followed by imported herbal, where you had a 5 to 6%, and then down to hashish, where there was a sort of amount of THC similar to imported herbal. But importantly, they were able to detect something else, which was CBD, cannabidiol, with a ratio of 1. And we'll see why this might be important. So does cannabis type matter? Well, in South London, it did seem to be quite important. So at that time, we had collected data from a large case-controlled study of first episode psychotic patients and population control from the same catchment area where actually the Institute of Psychiatry is based. And we had quite detailed information on cannabis use. And so I combined the information on frequency of cannabis use with the type of cannabis use people reported using. And we constructed what we called a sort of combined measure of frequency and type. You probably can't see it, the numbers, but all I want to show is that if you compare to people that never used, the one they used hashish, so raisin, they didn't matter with the frequency. They actually had a probability of suffering from psychosis that was really not significantly different from people that never used. But as soon as you enter the domain of skunk use, from people that only use at the week, less than at the weekend and every day, you actually had a significant increase in the probability of suffering from psychosis that went up to 5-fold for those who used skunk daily. So what is about hash that makes even frequency not relevant? Well, at least in the hashish, which people could access at the time of our study, perhaps it was this ratio 1-to-1. There have been now a variety of experimental studies, even in human, healthy volunteer, people with psychosis, that show that the psychotogenic property of THC can be actually ameliorated by simultaneous administration of CBD. So perhaps the CBD in the London hashish was protecting hashish users from the probability, at least, to develop a psychotic disorder. And our queen has taken our message very seriously. So now when she receives cannabis as a present, she makes sure it's not skunk by smelling it. And if it's skunk, she won't have it for tea. But something else that also we wanted to look at was something that actually Professor Badminton referred to in his plenary, which is, can we calculate the proportion of new cases of psychosis in our catchment area, so in South London, that can be attributed to skunk. Therefore, if we could abolish skunk use, how many cases of psychosis could we prevent? And the answer is, at least in South London, 24%. For any of you that work in early intervention or in a clinical setting, 24% less of young people coming with psychosis is actually very significant, both clinically and also in terms of service provision. But of course, the world doesn't begin and end at this side of the English Channel. So what's happening in the rest of Europe? I don't know how many of you follow what's happening in UK, but one of the new proposals has been building a bridge across the channel. Well, I don't think it's needed because the channel is going to be filled with cannabis very soon. You'll be able to walk over it because one of the main issues across the channel and in UK is actually cannabis use. In fact, if you look at the data from the last report from the European Monitoring Centre from Drug Use and Drug Addiction, they say that cannabis still is the most commonly used drug across the whole of Europe, UK and mainland included. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the numbers for cocaine or amphetamine, but here we're talking about at least 4 times the one for cocaine and almost 10 times the one for amphetamine. So both in terms of last year and lifetime, these are by far the largest numbers. And what is interesting, though, that when we look at young adults, so 15 to 34, and we look at the proportion of young adults that reporting across Europe having used cannabis, it's 13.3, but this is not an homogeneous estimate. It goes from a minimum of 3.2 to a maximum of almost 24. So this also suggests that cannabis use is present across Europe, but perhaps not in an homogeneous way. So to be able to address the question of what's happening in relation to cannabis use and risk of psychosis across Europe, I was able to access data from an amazing collaborative effort, which included data collection of first episode psychosis patients, which were meant to be all the first episode psychosis patients that were presented to the mental health services of the center, including the study, which is why I call them Incidence, and also population control. So these are not friends and family of academics, but these are actually controls that are meant to represent epidemiologically the catchment area population where the cases come from. And these are sort of the centers where the data were collected. And there were lots of effort in making the methodology of both identifying cases and assessing them and collecting information sort of highly reliable across the sites. So we have, of course, information on cannabis use, and these are the one I'm going to focus on. So my task was very interesting, but also very headache-provoking, which was to work out the potency of cannabis across all these different centers and countries, which is very difficult because not only the names are very different. I mean, we're talking about black market. We're not talking about a legal market. So each country has got names for pretty much similar type of cannabis, and the potency as well. So when I talk about potency, I talk predominantly the concentration of THC varies significantly. And not all countries have done a systematic analysis of the potency. But again, thanks to the European monitoring center, there were some data that I could access. But I needed to also look at London, because the data on London were a bit old. So this is me, as you can see, with a team from the London Drug Control Unit that usually looks at doping in athletes. And we were given by the Metropolitan Police a big suitcase of 350 samples of cannabis that I had to carry across, well, actually somebody else had to carry across central London with a great anxiety of bumping into police dogs, because believe me, when you open this case, the smell was extraordinarily strong. I actually did smell of cannabis for a few days. My Labrador at home was quite impressed with me for over a week. So the first interesting data was, and for me it was very important, because after the first set of data, people would come to me, especially some of my young patients, and say, oh, I can go out there and smoke hashish and I'll be fine, wouldn't I? Because you show that it's totally benign. Well, I think even when it comes to hashish, you have to be careful. So hashish in 2008 in London perhaps was benign, but already hashish in 2015 is presenting a quite alarming trend. Not only the ratio of THC, which is the yellow bars, and CBD in green are not one at all in any of the 9 samples we had analyzed at the time, but there are some samples like this one, which are outlier, worryingly so, which seem to be consistent with some reports of Morocco hash having become quite potent with an average of THC around 18%. So this is not an hashish that behaves as the one of the earlier data. But anyway, thanks again to this report, I was able to have a rough idea what I could expect in terms of THC across the different countries. And so with help of people who do animal model and have an idea of what potency of cannabis can, for instance, induce changes in terms of frontal lobe functioning or even cognitive or behavioral tasks, I imposed this cutoff for 10%. So I would call THC equal or greater than 10% as high potency cannabis, and anything below 10% low to moderate. You can understand, this is not a sophisticated cutoff, but we'll see that it's already beginning to give an idea of a measure of difference to associated with potency. So here I like to show you, analyzing the entire UGI sample, what happens when we look at some general measure of pattern of use. So for instance, here we have in blue first episode and in green controls, and this is the percentage, so the prevalence of lifetime use reporting the 2 groups of daily use of high potency, spending more, this should be 20 euro per week, and then using cannabis for the first time, age 15 or earlier. And if we translate this in odds ratio, which are adjusted as much as I could, so there are some markers of social demographic characteristic, but also a quite detailed other drugs information compared, for instance, to the study from London. And so you can see that when you ask people, have you ever used cannabis, yes or no, you really get a very tiny increase in the odds ratio. And this is quite, I always say this is quite intuitive. Any of us who have worked with addiction know that you don't ask people who use alcohol, have you ever drunk alcohol, yes or no, and then you separate alcoholics from people who only drink socially. You need to ask about pattern of use. So this is a pretty useless measure of harm. But then what about if we get into daily use? The odds ratio begins to become interesting, 3.4. 1.5 actually when you ask potency. So this measure of potency, when you look at the whole of Europe, is a bit diluted, and we'll see why that might be. Spending more than 20 pounds a week, which again is an indication of amount of cannabis use, gives a quite nice odds ratio, 2.4. And then using before the age 15 gives a bit of a disappointing odds ratio, 1.6, although it's significant. And then I did, and don't worry about all the bars. This is the point I'm trying to make, is that I tried to replicate in the whole of the UGI sample what I had seen in the previous London study, combining frequency with type. And consistently with the previous data, when you get into daily use of what here I call THC equal or more than 10%, that's where you get the greatest effect. So this is the heavily adjusted odds ratio, which is almost 4. And this is an odds ratio which I only adjusted for age, gender, and ethnicity. Why do I do this? I do this because people sometimes ask me, well, if it's all about high potency, why early cannabis and psychosis studies, even back to the 90s or late 80s, did show an association, given that in those days there was no high potency? Because actually, if you use daily, even low potency cannabis, actually you do get into almost threefold increase in your risk of psychosis. And previous studies only were able to adjust for age, gender, and ethnicity. So it might actually be that what I find here is not very different from what they do, except that perhaps I'm more obsessed in terms of, and I have more data in terms of how many confounders I can control for. But what about young age? So what about this issue of age 15 or younger? If you are 15 or younger and you have a joint, does it really affect your risk? Is the brain so vulnerable because it's developing that is enough for very tiny exposure? Or there's something else we need to look in combination with age of first use? And so what I did is that I looked at using cannabis, using high potency at age 15 or younger. And you can see that, yes, you go from 1.6 to 2. I mean, epidemiologists probably would think this is not really a difference, and it isn't. It's around 2 increase in the probability. What if I look at daily use of at younger age? You go up to 3. What if I look at daily use of high potency at younger age? We're beginning to get a significant jump from here to here, which you might think indicate that there is a sort of additive effect, but there is actually not an interaction. So you have a contribution of both, of starting young and using a lot, but this statistically doesn't reach a sort of significant interaction. But I think the point I'm trying to make is that it's not just about starting young. Again, you need to start young and being at least a frequent users to see a significant effect. But what we have seen on the overall sample, does it represent an homogeneous effect of cannabis, or do we expect variation across at least some of the main sites of our sample? And so I decided to focus on daily use and high potency, otherwise you'd be bored to death. So this is a quite complicated slide, but all I want you to look is how the bars go up and down. So this is daily use by site. So these are some of the main sites. So the first one is London, then Cambridge, then you have Amsterdam and Leiden, Paris, and another part of outside Paris. Then you have Madrid and Barcelona, Bologna, Palermo, and then we actually have a contribution from Brazil. As you can see, you have sort of a significant peak in Amsterdam, you would expect that, and then you have the other followed by London and Paris. When the other odds ratio are actually quite tiny, Palermo's got 0.9 for daily users. There are not many daily users in Palermo. When you look at high potency, this is actually my favorite one. Well, again, the usual suspect, the most potent type of cannabis, we do know that, are actually in Amsterdam. And then London usually follows, and Paris is beginning to get a bit of the Morocco hashish I was mentioning before. But look at Palermo. Palermo actually has got a pathetic odds ratio, which is significantly below 1. And there is a reason for it, which tells you should look where your data come from, not just look at the result. So in Palermo, the only participant, I should say, that did use high potency were actually 4 controls who were wealthy enough to go to Amsterdam on holiday and tried high potency and reported it. But there was not available high potent cannabis actually in Palermo for you to be able to detect an effect on risk. This is actually, anyway, not significant. So what can we conclude for this first part of the data? So who are these cannabis users at risk of developing psychosis? So if we only focus on pattern and we forget perhaps about biological vulnerability, well, certainly using young and using a lot and preferentially trying high potency varieties is not good in terms of increasing your probability to develop psychosis. And I think this is a simple message, but that can be useful even in sort of clinical practice when if GPs or teachers or any professional who work with young people can use when some people confiding in them report cannabis use. So what about the second part of my second question? If we move to individual level, to population level, can we actually make any inference on changes in incidence in relation to availability of cannabis across Europe? To do that, you need data on incidence. You need to know if there are, first of all, variation across, in this case, across Europe. And thanks, as I said, to the work of James and one of his PhD students, Hannah Jongsma, published a paper that, if you haven't seen, I recommend you read in JAMA Psychiatry at the beginning of the year. They were able to show that across our study site, there was, when we looked at the all psychotic disorder incidence rates, these are the crude rates per 100,000, there was a 10-fold variation. And you can see here is the lowest 6.3 per 100,000 Santiago in Spain, up to London. This is not advertising for Palermo, where I come from, but it's just to say I didn't do a very smart move in going from somewhere with such a low rate of psychosis up to the highest in our study. These rates were adjusted for age, gender, and also ethnicity, and there still remained an 8-fold variation. So age, gender, and migration, that you might think are an important contribution to this, the differences do not explain the whole picture. So could I contribute to explain some of these differences with cannabis? So what I did here was to use the prevalence of daily use of cannabis in our population controls. If we do believe these are truly population controls that represent the local population, we can say that they tell us about availability and sort of habits or of cannabis consumption in that general population of where each of the incidence rates are calculated. And in red, you have the adjusted incidence rate for age, gender, and migration, so at least I can get rid of the effect of these three. And in green, you have the daily use in the controls of each of these centers. And you can see that where the incidence peaks, daily cannabis use peaks, and this is definitely the case for some of the main center. But is this statistically significant? Well, it is actually. It indicates a correlation of 0.75, which is actually a quite respectable correlation. And I can do the same with hypotency, which was really what I wanted to see, because we've seen that hypotency really varies in terms of availability across Europe. And again, we have, where is green, is a proportion of controls that use hypotency, which reflects availability. And in red, we have the same, obviously, adjusted incidence rates. And here we have a correlation of 0.68, which, again, is statistically significant. Does this mean that I can explain all the difference with cannabis? Obviously not, but there might be, this suggests that there might be a contribution of cannabis to this variation. But what if I go back to the usual population attributable fraction? Well, if I just focus on the high potency cannabis use, we can see that we go in the overall sample to an 11% across the whole of Europe. If we abolish high potency cannabis, perhaps we can prevent these 11% of cases. But if we look at London, we look at 32% that can be attributed to high potency. In Amsterdam, half of them. I mean, this is a huge population attributable fraction, which is actually calculated with an adjusted odds ratio. So I'm trying to take into account other contribution. Paris, 20%. Again, Bologna goes down to pretty pathetic 1.8%. So still worthwhile abolishing sort of high potency, but this really tells you that there is not much of it, as you can see from the percentage of controls. And then you go down to Palermo, where I told you there is no high potency, so you can't actually even calculate the population attributable fraction because the odds ratio is less than 1. So to summarize, what's the message? Yes, there are differences in pattern of cannabis use across Europe, and these differences might contribute to explain some of the differences in incidence rates that James and Hannah have recently published, and the population attributable fraction can further indicate how much we can prevent potentially of psychosis, for instance, if we do that decent public education in terms of high potency. And I just want to conclude saying, when I talk about harm and cannabis and psychosis, I talk about something that I know. But of course, there's been lots of interest because of the state's changes in policy about medicinal use. And recently a paper was published from Phil McGuire team suggesting that you add CBD, one of the cannabis compound, to antipsychotic, and you make psychotic patients better. So can we reconcile my data with the idea that you can also use cannabis as a medicine, a curative medicine? Well, why not? We all know what aspirin is, except it's only one active ingredient. So it's a very widely used drug. The WHO said it's the most widely used drug. We know what it does, very helpful for a variety of reasons. We know very well the side effects, some of which are actually quite dangerous. We also know that if we give it to children or adolescents, they develop a very serious encephalitis. So we do know when not to use it. We know the dose and we know the interaction. So if I present you the same slides for cannabis, what do we know about cannabis to prescribe it as medics? Well, first of all, we know it's not one compound. Two, we know a little bit, and hundreds, we've got no idea what they do. Adverse effects, well, I've talked to you about psychosis, but there are other adverse effects, and we're beginning to understand where they come from, but we're not entirely sure. Indication, we do know we can already do something with some of the cannabis compound. Most of these medications that are licensed are actually synthetic version, and they are one active ingredient, very carefully dosed. If you go to a pain clinic, they don't tell you in Europe to go and smoke 3 or 4 joints of a certain amount. They give you either dronabinol or nabilon. But also, and more importantly, medical cannabis, what's the dose? What's the exact active ingredient proportion? And what are the interactions? Do we know this? If some of you does, please tell me, and then I'll be very happy to begin to prescribe it. But I think potentially we can exploit lots of the good of cannabis, but I think we're still pretty much on this side, and it would be good to be able to know a bit more about this side to safely move towards a drug like aspirin when we know about the picture.